A billionaire takes a garbage collector as his date to an elite charity gala, but what she reveals leaves the entire room in stunned silence. Yes, you heard that right. A powerful Wall Street tycoon, smug in his wealth, escorts a woman from the streets into the most exclusive event of the year, thinking it's all a game. But by the end of the night, everything he thought about status, power, and dignity will be shattered. You won't want to miss what happens. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if you enjoy gripping true drama, make sure to like the story. Enjoy! Alexander Blake did not believe in charity, nor in the virtue of mankind. A self-made billionaire, whose empire ruled hedge funds and private equity, he thrived on the predictable corruption of the financial world. When the annual American Philanthropy Gala appeared on his calendar, it was an obligation, an event where the powerful could flaunt their wealth under the polished banner of generosity. Over a private dinner with fellow magnates days before the event, conversation turned to a cynical wager. Who could bring the most out-of-place guest to the gala? Alexander, always one to outdo his peers, raised his glass. "I'll bring a garbage collector. Let's see how the room handles that." A $500,000 bet sealed the deal. The next morning, riding through the icy streets of Manhattan, Alexander's eyes landed on a woman hunched over a trash bin on Lexington Avenue. Without hesitation, he ordered the driver to stop. He approached her, a crisp $1,000 bill in hand. I have an offer. Come as my date to a charity gala this Saturday. I'll pay you well." The woman straightened, brushing dark hair from her face. Her eyes were clear, steady. "Fine," she replied after a beat. "But I choose my dress." Alexander agreed. What did it matter? To him, she was a pawn. What Alexander didn't know was that Sophie Rivera recognized him immediately. The man standing before her had once graced the cover of Fortune magazine. The same man whose financial empire had indirectly contributed to the loss of her career and life as she knew it. This was no opportunity for revenge, but for truth. Cold truth, spoken in the place where it would sting most. By noon, an assistant had been dispatched to handle the details. Sophie played along, careful to reveal nothing. Alexander returned to his office, content. The game was underway. But over the next few days, unease crept into his mind. Reports came in. Sophie refused stylists and PR coaching. She said she knows how to present herself, an assistant murmured. Alexander reviewed security footage from the boutique. He watched her select a simple, elegant emerald dress, not a garish costume, but something befitting a woman of dignity. A flicker of curiosity stirred. Saturday arrived. The plaza gleamed with its usual opulence, awaiting New York's financial elite. Black SUVs delivered men in tailored tuxedos and women in shimmering gowns. Alexander arrived with Sophie on his arm. The moment they entered, the atmosphere shifted. Whispers spread like wildfire. Who was this woman in a modest dress beside one of America's richest men? Inside, Alexander paraded Sophie with practiced ease, yet her composed demeanor unsettled him. She met every gaze head-on, her movements deliberate. At the pre-dinner reception, Veronica Price, sharp-tongued wife of a senator, approached with a venomous smile. "How charming, Alexander. You do surprise us." Her gaze sliced through Sophie. Unfazed, Sophie replied calmly, "Good evening." Veronica retreated, visibly irked. Throughout dinner, the spectacle escalated. Then came the moment of calculated cruelty. Veronica, emboldened by champagne, tipped a glass of red wine onto Sophie's dress. The room gasped. Sophie merely dabbed at the stain, her posture unwavering. Alexander watched in growing discomfort. The night was no longer unfolding as he had imagined. As the evening progressed, Alexander found himself studying Sophie more intently. She spoke articulately, her eyes steady. The woman he had plucked from the street did not belong in this narrative of ridicule. She was no pawn. Toward the end of the evening, when the MC invited spontaneous remarks from the floor, a pause filled the room. Then, to Alexander's shock, Sophie stood and walked toward the stage. His pulse quickened. Control was slipping. The game was no longer his. As Sophie stepped onto the stage, the room seemed to freeze. Conversations halted, wine glasses hovered mid-air, and a ripple of discomfort spread among the guests. Alexander sat motionless, his pulse loud in his ears. He had expected her to shrink in the face of such an audience, to play the part of a bewildered outsider. Yet here she was, poised beneath the harsh stage lights, her chin raised, her gaze unwavering as she took hold of the microphone with deliberate calm. The room braced for awkwardness, for some pitiable fumbling. It never came. In a voice clear and firm, Sophie began to speak. She introduced herself without apology, without the slightest tremor. "My name is Sophie Rivera. Some of you may know me. Most of you will not. 2 years ago, I was a professor of philosophy at Columbia University. I spent my life teaching young minds about ethics, justice, and the frailty of human integrity." Her words struck the audience with quiet force, a stark contrast to the smug, self-congratulatory tone that had dominated the evening until that point. Around the room, gazes narrowed, some feigned indifference. Others watched with genuine curiosity, sensing a storm brewing beneath her composed surface. Without embellishment, Sophie recounted how she had uncovered a network of financial fraud orchestrated by a powerful group within the industry, a scheme that had siphoned funds through shell companies, laundered billions, and devastated countless lives. At the heart of it, she revealed, was Lawrence Benton, seated in the crowd that night, a man whose presence commanded respect and fear in equal measure. A murmur swept through the audience. Some turned to look at Benton, who remained expressionless, though the tightening of his jaw betrayed a flicker of tension. Sophie continued. After attempting to expose the scheme, she was met not with support, but with retaliation. False accusations of misconduct, professional ruin, legal harassment, all engineered to silence her. In less than a year, she had lost her career, her savings, and eventually, her home. The dignified figure on the stage was not a casualty, but a survivor, one who had waited patiently for a moment like this. Alexander sat transfixed. Every word dismantled the assumptions he had clung to. This was no random woman pulled from obscurity for the sake of a cheap wager. She had once belonged to their world, cast out by the very forces he and his peers manipulated with impunity. The audience was no longer whispering. A heavy, uneasy silence pressed down upon the room. Sophie's gaze swept across the faces before her, lingering on Benton, then moving to Alexander for the briefest moment. There was no accusation in her eyes, only a calm acknowledgement of the truth now laid bare. She ended her speech without dramatics, without calls for sympathy or justice. "I am here tonight, not to seek your approval nor your pity. I am here simply because someone offered me an invitation, and I chose to accept." With that, she stepped down from the stage, leaving a vacuum of stunned silence behind her. The applause that followed was sparse, hesitant, as if each clap carried a measure of guilt or uncertainty. Alexander could scarcely process the surge of emotions rising within him: shame, admiration, a gnawing sense of complicity. For the first time in years, the veneer of his cynicism began to crack. He glanced toward Benton, whose stony facade betrayed no outward sign of concern, though Alexander suspected the man's mind was already racing through damage control strategies. Across the table, Sophie sat once again, composed as ever. Alexander found himself unable to meet her gaze. As the evening limped on, conversation resumed in stilted tones. The charm of the gala had soured. People avoided discussing what had just transpired, choosing instead to cling to trivialities. Yet beneath the surface, the air was charged with unspoken awareness. Alexander moved through the remainder of the night on autopilot, haunted by a growing realization that he could no longer pretend ignorance. The comfortable detachment he had cultivated over decades was faltering. He left the event early, foregoing the usual round of congratulatory back-patting and late-night toasts. Alone in the back of his car, he replayed Sophie's words in his mind, each sentence a stone thrown through the fragile glass of his self-image. At his penthouse, Alexander poured himself a drink and stood before the towering windows overlooking the city. The glittering skyline seemed suddenly hollow, the lights of the financial district taunting him with their cold brilliance. His entire career had been built on ruthless pragmatism, on seizing opportunities without moral hesitation. Yet now, faced with the simple, unvarnished truth Sophie had presented, he found no solace in the numbers or the accolades. The bet he had made, so cavalierly conceived, had exposed far more than he had anticipated. Not about Sophie, but about himself. For the first time in a long while, Alexander felt the weight of choices made and paths taken. The image of Sophie, standing firm beneath the scrutiny of the elite, haunted him. In her, he saw a strength he could not buy, a dignity that could not be manufactured. The thought unsettled him more deeply than he cared to admit. What had started as a game had become a reckoning. And deep down, Alexander knew the story was far from over. In the days following the gala, Alexander Blake could not escape the echo of Sophie Rivera's words. They replayed constantly in his mind, each line stripping away layers of complacency he had spent years constructing. He tried to drown them out with routine, meetings, reports, calls with investors. But every familiar face seemed to carry the weight of her accusations. Worse still was the gnawing suspicion that her claims about Benton's criminal empire were not exaggerated. Alexander had always known the man operated in morally grey territory, but now the shades looked much darker. For the first time in a decade, Alexander began to question the foundation of his own empire. Driven by an urgency he did not yet fully understand, Alexander initiated a quiet review of his firm's dealings, focusing particularly on partnerships and transactions tied to Benton's financial web. He enlisted the help of his most trusted internal auditor under strict confidentiality. Within 48 hours, the initial findings arrived, and they confirmed what he had feared. Several investments had passed through entities now known to be controlled by Benton's network. On paper, everything appeared legal, layered, sanitized, protected by teams of high-priced attorneys. But beneath the surface lay clear evidence of systematic money laundering and fraudulent asset inflation. Worse yet, some of Alexander's personal gains had been directly enhanced by these shadow operations. The revelation struck him with a force no market crash or legal threat ever had. His success, his identity, had been built in part on a lie, and now there was no plausible deniability. Benton had manipulated everyone, but Alexander had chosen to look away, to accept the comfort of ignorance. Not anymore. The next logical step was to confront Benton himself. A private meeting was arranged under the guise of a strategic discussion. When they met, Benton's demeanor was as smug and unshaken as ever. "I assume you're here because of that little speech," Benton began, eyes narrowing. "Don't let it distract you. The girl is nobody. We've weathered worse." Alexander remained silent for a long moment, studying the man who had once been an ally, a model of ruthless ambition. "I've reviewed the records," he finally said. "We are exposed, and you know it. Benton laughed softly. "Of course we're exposed, everyone is. That's why no one talks. You'd be a fool to start now." The casual arrogance, the utter disdain for consequence, sickened Alexander more than any ledger entry could. The conversation ended without agreement, without threat, just a quiet certainty that lines had been drawn. Alexander left the meeting with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. That evening, alone in his office, Alexander made his decision. The firm, the fortune, the standing, none of it mattered if he remained complicit. It was not about saving face or seeking redemption. It was about ending a cycle of cowardice he had long ignored. He spent the next 2 nights compiling documentation, pulling transaction records, internal memos and private communications that would expose the full breadth of Benton's operation. Each document copied was a brick removed from the wall Benton had built to shield himself. When the evidence was complete, Alexander contacted federal authorities through an intermediary. There would be no grand statement, no press conference, just hard facts delivered to those with the power to act. In parallel, Alexander began preparing for the fallout. He knew the board would resist, that investors would panic, but he no longer cared. A resignation letter was drafted, succinct, unembellished, final. It would be delivered the moment the investigation became public. There was one final task to complete. Without warning or ceremony, Alexander burned the physical remnants of the wager that had set this chain of events in motion: the bet slip, the transaction notes, even the invitation list annotated with Sophie's name. Watching the flames consume the paper, he felt no triumph, only a somber resolve. Before the dawn broke, Alexander sent a brief message to Sophie. "You were right. I can't undo the past, but I can act now." There was no reply. He didn't expect 1. This was no appeal for forgiveness, only an acknowledgement of truth. The days that followed were a blur of controlled chaos. News of the federal inquiry broke quickly, triggering an immediate storm across the financial community. Benton's empire began to unravel under the weight of the evidence provided. Arrests were made, assets were frozen. The media frenzy spared no one. But through it all, Alexander remained deliberately silent. When the board demanded explanations, he handed them his resignation and walked away without a backward glance. Colleagues pleaded with him to fight, to deny involvement, to protect what remained of his legacy. He refused. His mansion remained dark, his accounts untouched. For the first time since building his empire, Alexander chose absence over influence. In the weeks that followed, he kept to the shadows, observing the collapse from a distance. Benton, defiant to the end, was eventually led away in handcuffs, his downfall as inevitable as it was deserved. Through it all, Alexander carried a single image in his mind. Sophie standing on that stage, her voice unwavering amid a sea of false smiles. She had not sought revenge or pity. She had simply spoken the truth, and in doing so she had forced a reckoning he could no longer ignore. Now, as the dust settled, Alexander found himself at a crossroads he had never imagined. The future was uncertain, stripped of the certainties that had once defined him. But in that uncertainty, for the first time, he felt something unfamiliar: hope. The storm Alexander had unleashed was swift and relentless. In the span of 2 weeks, Benton's name was dragged through every major financial headline, each revelation more damning than the last. His network of shell corporations was exposed, his political connections severed as senators and CEOs scrambled to distance themselves from the collapse. As the public spectacle unfolded, Alexander kept to the background, refusing all interview requests and declining to appear at any company meetings. His resignation stood uncontested, though former allies pleaded with him to recant. They saw the damage spreading, but for Alexander, The moment for self-preservation had passed. He had made his choice with full understanding of the consequences. Private, Alexander monitored the proceedings with a cold, steady resolve. Watching Benton's empire disintegrate brought no satisfaction, only a deepening awareness of how much rot had festered beneath the surface of his own success. Yet even as his world unraveled, he knew one loose thread remained: his relationship with Sophie. Since his terse message acknowledging her role in his awakening, there had been no further contact. She remained silent, absent from the media circus and the financial fallout. For reasons he could not fully articulate, Alexander felt compelled to see her again, not to explain himself, nor to seek gratitude, but simply to close a chapter that had irrevocably altered both their lives. Tracking her down was not difficult. She had returned to a modest existence, teaching part-time at a local community center, and occasionally lecturing at small academic gatherings. One crisp afternoon, Alexander stood across the street from the center where she now taught, watching as she emerged with a stack of books under one arm. She moved with the same quiet confidence that had stunned him at the gala. After a long moment, he crossed the street and called out softly. She turned, her expression unreadable. "You didn't have to come," she said calmly. "I know," he replied, "but I needed to. Not for apologies. I've made peace with what I had to do, but for myself, to acknowledge what your courage accomplished." They spoke briefly, words exchanged without pretense. Alexander made no attempt to justify the past. Sophie offered no absolution. Yet in the quiet understanding between them, something shifted. Without fanfare, their conversation ended with a simple nod, a tacit recognition that both had moved forward on separate paths. As Alexander walked away, he felt a weight lift, not absolution, but clarity. The decisions that lay ahead would be made with eyes wide open, no longer clouded by the arrogance that once defined him. In the weeks that followed, Alexander retreated from public life entirely. He sold off properties, severed remaining business ties, and declined all offers to consult or advise. The financial world speculated wildly about his next move, but Alexander ignored it all. His focus was no longer on rebuilding an empire, but on living deliberately, free from the corrosive influence of unchecked ambition. He read voraciously, traveled anonymously, and immersed himself in causes that once seemed beneath his notice. Without announcing it, he contributed quietly to legal funds supporting whistleblowers and investigative journalists, understanding that their battles were now his as well. Through it all, he carried a singular awareness. Change, real change, is not grand or public. It is a series of small, relentless choices made in solitude, guided by a conscience long neglected. Each day brought its own tests, opportunities to retreat into cynicism or to continue forward in the harder, unfamiliar path of integrity. Alexander chose the latter, fully aware that redemption was neither owed nor guaranteed. It was enough that he acted with intention, no longer hiding behind wealth or influence. When Benton was finally sentenced, convicted on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice, Alexander watched the news coverage alone, the television volume low. There was no triumph in seeing the man led away in shackles, only a grim acknowledgement that justice had for once pierced the fortress of privilege. The victory was not his to claim, nor was it Sophie's alone. It belonged to truth, spoken without fear on a stage where it was least welcome. Months passed. The financial world moved on, reshaped but unchanged in its hunger for power. Alexander remained apart, a ghost in the corridors where he once reigned. And yet, in that absence, he found a new presence within himself, an understanding of value. Unbound from wealth or status, he knew there would be no return to the life he had abandoned. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in decades, it was his to choose freely, guided not by profit, but by principle. In that quiet freedom, he discovered a purpose more enduring than any fortune could provide. The invitation arrived unexpectedly, an embossed envelope delivered to the small apartment where Alexander now lived. It was the annual American Philanthropy Gala, the very same event where his life had fractured. The irony was not lost on him. Against all instinct, he considered attending. Not as a figurehead of industry, not as a participant in the hollow rituals of the elite, but as a man with nothing left to prove and no reputation to defend. The decision came quietly, without ceremony. He would go not to make a spectacle, but to complete a journey that had begun with arrogance and ended in painful clarity. When the night arrived, Alexander entered the plaza alone, his presence drawing immediate notice. Whispers rippled through the crowd. The man who had once commanded the room with his wealth now moved through it with deliberate calm, stripped of the trappings that once defined him. Gone was the tailored entourage, the calculated air of superiority. In its place stood a man unchanged in stature, but transformed in substance. He did not seek out familiar faces, nor linger in old circles. Instead, he waited for the inevitable moment when the room would turn its gaze upon him. It came swiftly. During the formal program, an unexpected announcement was made, an open forum for reflections on integrity and responsibility in the philanthropic sector, a tone clearly influenced by the events of the past year. Without hesitation, Alexander rose and approached the stage. The audience, caught between curiosity and discomfort, watched in tense silence as he took the microphone. He spoke without flourish, his voice measured and resolute. Last year, on this very stage, a woman spoke truth that many of us were unwilling to face. She exposed not only a network of fraud, but a culture of complicity that allowed it to flourish. I was part of that culture. I chose not to see. I chose silence. No more. With methodical precision, Alexander laid out the facts, documents, communications, and financial trails he had personally compiled and delivered to authorities. He made no excuses, offered no appeals for sympathy. The price of truth is high, he concluded, but the cost of silence is far greater. The room remained suspended in a collective breath, the polished facades of its attendees cracking under the weight of a reality they could no longer ignore. The impact was immediate and irreversible. Within days, fresh investigations were launched, this time extending beyond Benton's now ruined empire into broader circles of influence. Alexander's testimony became a catalyst, forcing long-protected alliances into the harsh light of accountability. He declined all media requests, issued no public statements beyond his words at the gala. His role was not that of a savior, but of a man fulfilling a responsibility too long deferred. As the legal dominoes fell, Alexander receded further from public view. His days became a quiet rhythm of study, reflection, and deliberate action. He supported emerging investigative efforts discreetly, understanding that the fight for integrity was ongoing and fragile. The financial world, ever restless, moved on to new headlines, but for those who looked closely, the scars of the reckoning remained. Sophie, true to her nature, maintained her distance from the spectacle. She neither sought recognition nor allowed herself to be drawn into the narrative constructed by media and industry alike. Alexander respected her choice, understanding now that her strength lay not in public vindication, but in the quiet assertion of truth. Their paths crossed only once more, in a chance encounter devoid of drama or closure. A simple exchange of glances, a nod of mutual acknowledgement, and then each continued forward, changed but unbound by the past. In the months that followed, Alexander embraced a life defined by simplicity and intention. He shared possessions once mistaken for identity, choosing instead to invest in work that aligned with the values he had rediscovered. His wealth, diminished but sufficient, became a tool for quiet good rather than ostentatious power. He accepted solitude without regret, finding in it a clarity long absent from his days of corporate conquest. The world at large would remember Alexander Blake as a cautionary tale or a symbol of belated redemption, depending on the teller. He cared little for either version. What mattered now was not how he was perceived, but how he chose to live each remaining day, with eyes unclouded, conscience engaged, and a steadfast refusal to return to the blindness of his former life. In this unadorned existence, he found a depth of purpose that no fortune had ever provided. The seasons turned, unnoticed by many but not by Alexander Blake, who now marked time not by quarterly reports, but by quieter rhythms. His days unfolded without the urgency that had once defined them. He no longer rose to the shrill demands of financial markets, but to the soft pull of personal intention. The penthouse in Midtown remained empty, sold quietly, its proceeds dispersed with little fanfare. His address now was an unremarkable apartment on a tree-lined street where no one cared who he had been. Here he moved without entourage or obligation, in C. The early mornings, he frequented the same modest cafe, arriving just as the doors opened. He favored a corner seat by the window where light filtered gently through the glass, illuminating pages of the books that had become his companions. Philosophy, history, works of quiet introspection, subjects he had once dismissed as impractical, now consumed with a hunger born of necessity. The staff recognized him as a polite, solitary customer, tipping well but not extravagantly, never drawing attention to himself. Over time he became a fixture, another face in the quiet chorus of the city's mornings. News of the ongoing legal proceedings against figures once untouchable drifted through headlines. Alexander followed the developments with a measured detachment, reading enough to understand, but never indulging in the spectacle. Benton's conviction had rippled outward, unsettling networks that had long believed themselves impervious. More than a few of Alexander's former associates faced scrutiny, their hurried attempts at damage control as predictable as they were futile. Yet none of it tempted him back into the fray. The man who might once have sought to leverage such turmoil for personal gain had ceased to exist. From time to time, messages reached him from old acquaintances, veiled invitations to rejoin the world he had abandoned, to consult, to advise, to reclaim influence. Each was declined without hesitation, unanswered beyond the quiet deletion of the note. He owed no explanations. The life he now lived required no validation from those who had yet to question their own. What mattered was not the renunciation of power, but the deliberate choice to walk a different path, one shaped by a clarity he had once lacked. It was on a late autumn afternoon, cool and bright, that Alexander encountered Sophie Rivera once more. The meeting was unplanned, a fleeting intersection in the aisles of a small bookstore. She stood by a display of new releases, fingers tracing the spines of volumes with a familiar care. For a moment he observed her unnoticed, struck again by the unassuming strength that had first disarmed him. When their eyes met, there was no awkwardness, no need for words heavy with unresolved sentiment. They exchanged a quiet nod, a gesture that spoke of acknowledgement and understanding. In that simple moment, past wrongs and reckonings found their quiet place, not erased but no longer defining. Alexander continued his days with the same deliberate restraint. The fortune that remained to him was directed with care, invested in efforts that needed no publicity, no attached name to validate their worth. Legal funds, educational programs for those silenced by systemic power, support for investigative journalism, all sustained discreetly. He did not attend the events these efforts supported, nor sought recognition among their beneficiaries. The work was not about redemption or image. It was about choosing each day to align actions with the truths he now carried. Evenings found him walking through the quieter parts of the city, favoring streets where anonymity was easy. He had come to value solitude not as exile, but as freedom. The noise of ambition no longer dictated his pace. In the faces of passers-by, he saw lives shaped by struggles and hopes once invisible to him. Now, they mattered, not in abstract terms or as subjects of charity, but as fellow travelers deserving dignity without condition. When invitations to the next American Philanthropy Gala arrived, as they inevitably did, Alexander returned them unread. He needed no stage upon which to perform his new convictions. The work he had begun was not for grand rooms or public accolades. It lived in the quiet persistence of daily choices, in the discipline of remaining unseen where once he had sought the spotlight. Over time, his name faded from the headlines, supplanted by newer scandals, fresher faces eager for prominence. In this erasure, he found a strange comfort. To no longer be a symbol was to be free to simply be. The man who had once measured worth in influence now found contentment in moments unnoticed. A well-worn book, a conversation with a barista, the shifting light across a quiet cafe table. There were no grand gestures to mark the journey he had undertaken, no proclamations to signal its end. The transformation remained in the texture of his days, in the choices made without audience or applause. Those who might look closely would find no dramatic reinvention, only a man who now moved through the world with eyes open and a conscience engaged. In the measured cadence of this new life, Alexander Blake discovered not absolution, but a deeper form of understanding. The past remained, its lessons etched into the fabric of who he had become, yet it no longer dictated the shape of his future. Each day offered the chance to choose differently, to honor truth not in words, but in living. And in that quiet, steady commitment, he found a peace more enduring than any victory once sought.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Your support helps us grow and bring you even more amazing content. See you in the next one.